Hi everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of Europe Climate Connection with Olivia Saxer and myself, Rachel Brabbins.
Hi everyone. This is a podcast created by Climate Action Network Europe to highlight the variety and depth of our incredible network members who are working on the climate emergency and energy transition.
Thanks, Olivia. Wow, I can't believe we're doing our first episode of this exciting podcast. How are you feeling?
Same as you, really excited to be able to showcase the work of our members.
We've got some fantastic guests. So let's get down to business. The climate event of the year is fast approaching, COP, where for nearly 3 decades, the UN has been bringing together almost every country on Earth for a global climate summit. Egypt will host the 27th annual summit, which comes following a summer of heat waves, fire and droughts across Europe, global food and energy crises exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Horn and Sahel regions of Africa on the brink of famine, and flooding across 1/3 of Pakistan.
Last year at the COP in Glasgow, there was a lot of talk about loss and damage, which normally refers to destructive impacts of climate change we can no longer avoid or adapt to. And as we know, this is being felt most acutely in the global south and small island states who are bearing the brunt of extreme weather events caused by climate change. There was some uncertainty over whether or not this issue would be officially on the agenda for this year, and it has now been confirmed. Loss and damage will be officially present and hopefully center stage. Our conversation happened just before we heard that positive news.
That's right, Olivia. And our very first special member guest is Rebecca Thissen, climate justice policy expert from Belgian organisation CNCD 11-11-11, who has a strong track record in climate justice and has recently returned from a trip to Senegal.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for joining us for our very first episode of Europe Climate Connection.
Hi, Olivia. Hi, Rachel. Happy to be here as well.
Maybe to start us off, could you tell us a bit more about what you do at CNCD 11-11-11 and also what this organization is about?
Yeah, sure. So I am a policy officer on climate justice at CNCD 11-11-11, very complicated name. So I focus mainly, but not only, on the international dimension of the climate policies. So, for example, I'm going every year to the COPs. CNCD is a big umbrella organization, a bit like CAN, but we focus mainly on international solidarity topics. So not only about climate, but also about migration, fiscality, gender, and so on. And we do not only do advocacy work, but also campaigning and fundraising.
You mentioned the COP, and it is coming up. So now when it comes to the commitments under the Paris Agreement, which are limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, we know that emissions remain too high, and we're not on track to meet this 1.5 degree target. Could you maybe give us an update on what progress happened during the last COP, COP26? And was there anything specific for developing countries to deal with climate change and its increasing impacts?
Well, as I imagine everybody know, this COP26 was the most important since Paris. So the pressure was on. And the pressure came also from developing countries who rightly were waiting for more commitment and also respect from commitments from richer nations who actually are not on track to stay well below 1.5 degrees. So the mitigation efforts are far from being enough right now. And of course, it's to the biggest polluters and the historic emitters to do that first and to lead by example. Secondly, we're also far from having fair commitments regarding climate finance. So there was also a lot of pressure, and there will be more and more pressure regarding that topic. Having more money for mitigation and adaptation in developing countries is essential. And lastly, I'm sure we will talk more about that. There is still nothing happening on loss and damage finance so far, while it's a clear reality. We know also from the last IPCC reports that now no region anywhere of the world is spared from climate impacts. It's happening everywhere, but we also know that the limits of adaptation, so the situation where we see loss and damage, are currently happening everywhere, but mainly in developing countries.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was a really great overview and, of course, lots to fit in. But I'd like for us to take a look now and have a bit of a reality check on loss and damage at this year's COP. What are your expectations?
I think we have two main objectives for this COP coming up. First, having loss and damage finance on the agenda. It might sound a bit silly because it may sound logical for some of you, but actually it's a real technical fight. So when COP27 will get the opening, I think that will be the first real trick negotiation. Will we talk or not about loss and damage finance? And I think if the answer will be no, we can expect very, very strong fight and opposition from mainly developing nation, but also civil society. And secondly, of course, when we get more to the content and not only the agenda fight, we have to be able to discuss properly what the finance facility will look like and what are the main aspects of it, the guarantees, how to make sure that the money will reach exactly the more affected communities and not being just a big promise that actually never touched the ground.
Many people say that COP27 will be an African COP because it will happen in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And at the same time, you have this African continent that is very exposed and vulnerable to extreme weather events and will be even more exposed and vulnerable as climate change impacts happen. So we expect this to be at the center of discussions. How realistic do you think this is? And also how participatory can we expect this COP to be?
Yeah, so I'm really expecting the Egyptian presidency to put climate justice issue forward. We already see in their speeches and different documents that they're talking more and more about common but differentiated responsibilities, which you may know is a very strong principle, recognizing the fact that if we all have a responsibility towards fighting climate change, it's of course not to all of us to do the same amount of efforts. And so that, of course, leads to more responsibility toward the global north. So I think that will be very present in all discussion in every room. And it makes sense also because Africa is the greatest illustration of climate injustice, being the least responsible but the most impacted continent. Regarding the participatory discussion, that's a more tricky one because, as you may know, every presidency being from the UK, being from Egypt, being from Chile, has a bit in its hand the role to make participation easier and more accessible, not only for delegates and diplomats, but also for civil society. And we fear that it will be very hard for civil society, and especially African civil society, to participate actually to this COP. And I think we should be very aware of having a COP that's closed to civil society representative, or it's actually not an inclusive COP. And the other issue that's more specific, of course, to the Egyptian context is the human rights situation. We know that we have many opinion prisoners in Egypt right now, and that's also something that's very concerning regarding freedom of speech, freedom of protest. And that's something that's very linked also to the negotiation, of course. It's not only about technicalities and having a final text at the end of a COP. It's also about being able to hear the voice of the voiceless.
Just moving on now, over the summer here in Europe, we experienced record-breaking heat waves, wildfires and droughts. And I think it's really hit home for a lot of people that what's been going on over the summer will be the new norm. But of course, this is, the global south has been experiencing extreme weather and the impacts of the climate emergency for decades now. And of course, we've all been witnessing high-profile media coverage of the floods in Pakistan, which is obviously a very stark example of loss and damage. But some crises are barely or have very little coverage in the media, particularly the food crises in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. Now, you recently travelled to Senegal. Can you tell us a bit about that trip and what you experienced there in terms of loss and damage?
So we went to see two, if I can say it like this, two main loss and damage effects in Senegal. So first was sea level rise and coastal erosion. We just saw a village that had disappeared underwater. We saw a migrant camp of the people that has to be displaced because of that event. So many social and economic question rose, of course, regarding that situation. What do you do with the people that are displaced? How do you keep up with education, with security, with health? What do you do with non-economic losses regarding heritage, tradition, cultural, and so on and so forth? So that was, very self-talkative, and just like being there and talk with people, we understood how far we are still of finding solution on loss and damage, because of course sometimes you have adaptation measures that can help a bit. You have some disasters risks management solution that can help a bit, but we are still seeing a huge gap of loss and damage policies and loss and damage needs that still need to be fulfilled. So that was quite clear. And then we went to observe another phenomenon, which is desertification. And heat waves in the more center area of Senegal, where we met farmers and breeders who were affected by those weather events. And it's a more like a slow onset event that we call. So it's not like one extreme sudden event and then you have to build up after the catastrophe. It's rather a long-term situation where bit by bit the limits of adaptation are reached. And then you have to decide at some point, what do? You quit your job. And so you have economic impacts, of course, for your family and your community. Do you migrate? Do you go to other cities or other villages to try to find a new occupation, and so on and so forth? So kind of the same question rolls, but in a total different context. And also the non-economic loss and damage were also very present, knowing that they could not, for example, cultivate the same vegetables and seeds that they used to cultivate before, that their father and their father before them used to cultivate. So that was also very sad. I was not expecting it to be so concrete. And that's also a good thing about being on the field and on the ground, is really that you can get the reality better.
So when we talk about climate finance, one question that is not addressed so much is the polluters pay principle. So for example, to finance loss and damage. Do you have any thoughts on this? Do you think it's realistic to rely on huge emitters and polluters' money as a pathway to reach climate justice?
Well, I think it's essential, and I think it should really be a key principle in the negotiation, such as the common but differentiate responsibility. But I do think also that the global north actors are really trying to escape from that by, for example, saying that we are not so sure about their responsibility and not so sure that they are the ones that are polluting the most. That's, of course, eluding the historical dimension of the climate crisis. But I do think we need to find new leverage to make this polluter principle a reality, whether towards country to have, for example, a climate damage tax and finding new and innovative sources to finance those finance gaps that we see, and especially on loss and damage, of course, but also maybe taking into account that many oil and gas companies are making huge amount of money, especially now with their energy crisis. And I don't know if you saw that, but Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, just spoke recently, I think it was 1 or 2 days ago at the General Assembly, that we should actually put in place a tax on those companies to find new resources to find the climate justice objective that we all know. So whether it's about funding the gaps on climate finance or finding a new loss and damage finance facility.
And how about the concept of debt? Do you think there is a climate debt of rich countries to countries in the global south? And do you think that debt cancellation could be used as a tool?
So, I do believe that on the concept, there is a climate debt. So big historical emitters have, enjoyed the industrial revolution to develop themselves, to to build stronger and more resilient economies and so on and so forth, while it was totally not the case for developing countries and the developing world at that moment. So it's very important to realize that climate change is something that you cannot just take a picture of it now and say, okay, China and India are the big emitters. It's really something that has an historical dimension. And if you look at the historical dimension, you will easily find out where the debt is and who has to pay for it. We have the reality that the least responsible for the climate emergency are actually paying the stronger price. And this is also something that we need to address. It's just a matter of justice and a matter of responsibility. I think we should also fight the narrative that it's a question of generosity or charity. There's nothing linked to that. It's just a matter of fairness, responsibility, and common sense. Regarding debt, because I think debt is a broader topic than just regarding climate, something that still strikes me when we come back to climate finance is that a big part of the climate finance that's provided by a richer nation is actually provided in the form of loans. So it's actually worsening the debt of the beneficiaries of the developing countries. So I think not only recognizing that we have a climate debt, but also finding proper ways and fair ways to repair it is key in the debate.
At the last COP, we saw the Scottish government pledge £2 million for loss and damage. Do you think there's hope to see more strong financial commitments from governments on loss and damage at this COP?
Yeah, so following Scotland, we had Wallonia, or a tiny region in southern Belgium, that also pledges for 1 million on loss and damage. So that was also a positive signal, being also part of the European Union, although not being a country as such, but at least a tiny part. So we were really hoping that those two gestures will open a more positive dynamic around loss and damage finance. And now recently, I think it was 2 days ago, we saw that Denmark is the first country who pledges around $13 million for loss and damage. Of course, the details are not clear yet, but the signal is very strong. Having a country, and not just a part of a country, of a region, pledging for loss and damage money during the General Assembly of the United Nations is a super strong signal, opening the door for more. Having said that, so I think it's very positive. We have also to be careful to not escape from the crucial debate that we need to have towards the loss and damage finance facility. So it's very good to have countries pledging money a bit out of the blue, having ad hoc initiative, be able to fund projects to really exemplify what loss and damage finance is, could be, should be. That's good. But we shouldn't escape from the international debate that needs to happen in the negotiating rooms about how we're going to build this finance facility. So I think it's two paths that need to coexist, but we shouldn't lose sight of the main one.
And how about in terms of where that money goes and making sure that it actually reaches the communities that are most impacted, and kind of ensuring that transparency? And also there's a term that's used which is called additionality. What does that mean, and how does that feature in this?
So in the discussion with Wallonia, with Scottish NGO, we build up some criteria and guarantees that we wanted to see regarding those new loss and damage money to, as you mentioned, ensure that they are additional. So we are not taking money that's already pledged for climate finance, for example, to call it loss and damage finance and then having no new money at the end. But we also really wanted to add up in the debate. So make sure that if money is pledged, it reaches the right communities that are the most impacted, but also help to put the debate forward. For example, by having a research action project that would help to have more granular data, how it's actually a sudden event or a slow onset event impacting lives of farmers or of fishermen, and so on and so forth. So I think it's very good to use those pledges to have more concrete example and to bring a bit the reality inside the negotiating rooms, which is actually, I think, lacking. We also deep dive into technical words, technical numbers, but we always forget at the end of the COP what we're actually talking about. We're talking about people's lives and people's futures as well. So I think in that way, if those pledges respect the series of criteria and guarantees, I think they could really bring something into the debate. But that needs to be scrutinized. And I will make sure that I do that, at least for Wallonia.
That's great to hear, and so nice to have positive examples. So, just finally, we're almost wrapping up now. So let's return to COP27. How realistic do you think it is that significant ground will be made in establishing a financial instrument for loss and damage? And do you think that the loss and damage agenda in general will be significantly improved? And what concrete political expectations do you have?
It's a tricky question, between being optimistic and realistic. I do think loss and damage will be the central issue at COP27. I think it will be present in every negotiating room. So not only the one that will talk about loss and damage, but also the one that are addressing finance, transparency, carbon markets. I think it will be really a matter of diplomatic balance, and a clear tension will be set up between developing countries, notably because they are chaired, the G77 in China is chaired by Pakistan, who has made clear a few days ago as well, after the floods, that they want to see a finance facility at COP27. So it is sure that there will be a common position from the G77 and China, which means that half of the negotiating blocks will be in favor of such a facility. But we also saw, I don't know if you saw that video of John Kerry being very, very clear about the fact that they don't want to hear about it. And we have to focus on mitigation, knowing that the USA are not at all cutting emission enough, and adaptation, while again, United States are not fulfilling their climate finance commitments. So that's a bit irony. But so we have kind of the position clear for the COP as even started. But I'm quite hopeful that we had a year since COP26. I think the debate went forward. I think some line has been crossed regarding comprehension and understanding of what do we mean with loss and damage and what are the needs. So I do think it will be very complicated to achieve a decision on the loss and damage facility as such. I think there's still lack of maturity in some negotiating blocks, especially in developed countries. But I do think we can go further than what was agreed at COP26, which is basically a dialogue called the Glasgow Dialogue, which is far from being enough. And for now, from what I saw, it's just a talk shop. And we don't need a talk shop. We need something that actually channels money towards the most affected. So I think we will find a compromise, and I just hope this compromise will be as ambitious as it could get. Otherwise, I think we can lose a bit faith in international negotiation, to be very frank. If we don't reach something that seems fair for the developing world, I don't know how we can go further after that.
Absolutely. And what role do you see the EU taking in the negotiations? Of course, then you mentioned the US. But what about the EU? How can they push the loss and damage agenda further forward?
Well, I think since the last commission, the EU has a good narrative on the climate policy. So they want to be the most ambitious, the first climate neutral continent, and so on and so forth. But that's now not being enough anymore. So they have also to commit something regarding their international commitments and respect first what they pledged, but also they have to become a real ally on the loss and damage debate. I'm not hoping the United States to go forward. I am expecting them to be the main blocker, but the EU can have a more like a neutral and diplomatic role within the discussion. Having Denmark being now a good student in the story, an ally, I think the EU could shift a bit its position and then maybe open some compromises and some more conclusion on the loss and damage debate. And that will be an evolution regarding what happened at COP26, where they had a really bad positioning at the conclusion of the COP. And I also think, again, it's a matter of credibility. You cannot name yourself climate leader if you're not able to actually really participate to the climate diplomacy story. It's not only about domestic emission. It's not only about the Green Deal. It's about the whole world, and it's a global challenge. So I think that's what the EU needs to prove at COP27.
Thanks so much for joining us, Rebecca, on our first ever Europe Climate Connection podcast. And thanks to all of our listeners. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we hope you can join us next time when we'll be focusing on the energy crisis and how to keep our homes warm whilst transitioning away from fossil fuels.
You have been listening to Europe Climate Connection, an original podcast presented by Can Europe. Climate Europe Connection is hosted by Olivia Saxer and Rachel Brabbins. Samuel Martin Sosa is the executive producer and editor. Script by Rachel Brabbins. Recorded and edited by Big Audio Media that also provided training, mentorship and assistance during the process.
And you can subscribe to Climate Europe Connection via your favourite podcasting platform and find out more about our work at Climate Action Network Europe on our website, caneurope.org. Take care, thanks again for listening, and see you all next time.
Thank you all, and see you next time.